Hello everyone, many thanks for your attendance. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Dag Nikolaus Hasse to you here in Center for Islamic Studies. I would like to also thank the Center for Islamic Studies to host this talk. Professor Hasse is a history of philosophy in Würzburg University in Germany. As an expert of Arabic philosophy and sciences, and also Latin philosophy and science. Moreover, of their interactions, he wrote several books and articles. In 2016, Professor Hasse was awarded the prestigious Leibniz Prize, the highest distinction for a scientist in Germany. Among his numerous books, articles, and research projects, I can mention some of them. He is the founder of the project Arabic-Latin Online Glossary and Corpus. He and his team have been developing it for more than 10 years and give us a great source to see a common heritage between Arabic and Latin traditions. You can find it on the internet as open access. His first monograph, Avicenna's De Anima in the Latin West, was published in 2000. It shows us the reception of Ibn Sina in the Latin West. One of his last books, Success and Suppression, Arabic Sciences and Philosophy in the Renaissance, was published in 2016 by Harvard University Press. It has been already accepted as a classic in the history of philosophy in Renaissance. The book shows us in all detail that Arabic sciences and philosophy played an important role in Western Renaissance. Hasse monitors the influence of Arabic in intellectual development, debates, and controversies of the Renaissance. This book is awarded by the prestigious Sheikh Zayed Book Award in 2018. I have good news. This big volume book was recently translated by Zahid Tiryaki into Turkish and soon will be published by Vakıfbank Kültür Yayınları. Last but not least, his last book was ist europäisch, so überwindend kolonialer und romantischer Denkformen by Reklam Verlag in 2021. This book took a great attention of German audience and questioning deeply what European means for several respects. It was translated into Turkish by Selahattin Akdi, Avrupalı nedir, sömürgeci ve romantik düşünme biçimlerinin üstesinden gelmek. And it was published last year by the Vakıfbank Kültür Yayınları. You can find outside this book. In his book, he challenged some intellectual cliches and hegemonies created in the time of colonialism and romanticism. Rather than a cultural and philosophical concept of Europe, which was a historical fabrication, he offers us a geographical sense of Europe, which gives a fair place to Europe among others. Today, his talk has a similar approach with this book. Thank you, Professor Hasse. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Is the microphone? Yeah, everything. Do I need this one? Probably not. Yeah. Thank you very much for the introduction, Kadia. Thank you for the invitation to ISAM. It's a pleasure to be here in Istanbul. It's the first time, and on Monday I was giving a lecture in Medeniyet University as a guest of Zahid Tiryaki, and today I'm here, and I was pampered by my two hosts for 2 and 3 days, and I've seen so much. It's really absolutely wonderful. I'm so grateful for this generosity. And I mean, of course, Istanbul is an impressive city, and I've done research, as probably some of you too, and on intellectual traditions also in this city. But if you are not in the place, you cannot imagine how it is like. Yeah. No image can transport the space, the feeling how it is like to be here. So I'm really very happy to be here. And the topic today is what is European on Eurocentrism and anti-Europeanism. And the idea is to talk, of course, a little bit about the topic of the book, and there's the Turkish translation that I cannot understand because it's a shame, so I don't have Turkish. Yeah, I know Arabic, but I don't have Turkish. But Kadir says it's a good translation, and I trust his judgment. What I want to do is to take out some theses out of this book and try to think together with you about what it means to criticize Eurocentrism and what it means not to fall into anti-Europeanism. When you criticize Eurocentrism, as I guess many of you also do, then we could talk, of course, about what Western or Midwestern Europeans have done in the past, like terrible things, military occupations, subjugation of peoples, and so on. But that's not my topic today. In a sense, that's about colonialism, that's important to do, but it has often been done. But the topic I have here is to point to the ongoing arrogance that we still find among Midwestern Europeans without realizing, without Midwestern Europeans realizing it, and without sometimes non-Europeans realizing it, that they are also employing Eurocentrist cliches. And I start with a quotation from Emmanuel Macron. Here I translate into English. I hope it's big enough. This Europe, where every European, chaque Européenne, recognizes his destiny in the profile of a Greek temple or in Mona Lisa's smile, where they can feel European emotions in the writings of Musil or Proust, this Europe of the cafes described by Steiner, this is George Steiner, this Europe that Suarez called Elan, a spirit accustomed, this Europe of landscapes and folklore, this Europe of Erasmus, Desiderius Erasmus of Rotterdam, what holds it together is its culture, says sa culture. Now you may find this is perhaps normal, such a way of speaking, but it's strange. I find it strange by now, because for various reasons, I want to point some of these reasons out to you. And for instance, the cafes. George Steiner, in a famous article, it's an essay on the idea of Europe of 2004, writes, so long as there are coffee houses, the idea of Europe will have content. That's strange, because I have been to some coffee houses here in Istanbul. It's obviously not an invention that was made on the continent of Europe or in Midwestern Europe, but as you can see here, we have a coffee house here in a depiction of 1838 in Istanbul with a storyteller, with a Medda. The coffee houses appeared in the Islamic world when the coffee was transported via the Red Sea, first around Mecca, then we have news that we have coffee houses in Cairo, later further north, in other cities, and around the middle of the 16th century, first time on the European continent, on the other side of the Bosphorus, in Constantinople, Istanbul. So why having even Macron saying we recognize European culture, like Mona Lisa, like a Greek temple, like Proust or Musil? This is so elitist. Very few of us really have read Proust or Musil. This is big books, and some find them boring rather than European emotions. So there's something very strange about this appealing to these things, and especially to a cultural practice that binds together North Africa, West Asia, and Europe. The coffee house is difficult to find in that sense, where you can also talk about poetry, about politics. There are enough sociological studies about the role of coffee houses. You have opposition, the Janitsars, for instance, in Ottoman coffee houses, or in Paris, Émile Zola, or whatever. Yeah. So it's, in that sense, it's a combined cultural practice that binds the three areas together. But it's difficult to find it in North America or in Australia. So why am I making it European? That is strange. So that's the way I would like to talk to you about cliches, of Eurocentric cliches that are very present still at the moment. Even if French troops or German troops or English troops don't conquer countries at the moment, fortunately, we still observe a certain form of arrogance. And I would like to point to two, these are four chapters of the book. I just want to point to two persistent cliches. That Europe is the continent of reason, or the spirit of reason, and the continent of enlightenment. And with this, people mean Western Europe. And the other cliche is more conservative, that it's a fusion, that the essence of European values is a fusion of Christianity and Greek rationality. You can find this, for instance, expressed in classical gymnasia in Germany, but also when you open ordinary history books, you often get a Greek temple, symbolizing Greek rationality. And I grew up with studying Old Greek in school, and I love it. There's no way, I love reading Plato and Aristotle and so on. So I don't have a problem with that, but making it the invention of rationality is strange. And that's the second cliche. So let's turn to the first. And before I do it, let us look at geography for a moment. Geography, if we give names to certain parts of the surface of the world, is also a discourse. It's not a given, it's something we fight about. But it's much more stable, geographical names, than cultural names. A cultural space like Europe is very unstable, but a geographical space is much more stable, also in the discourse. So it was for a long time clear, and has always been clear for most writers in the area of North Africa, West Asia, and Europe, that Gibraltar, you know where Gibraltar is, Gibraltar, Dardanelles, and Bosporus are the borders of Asia and Africa and Europe. And then probably, for most ancient Greek writers, it's the the Bay of Azov, east of Crimea, and later then, so the Crimea always belonged to the continent of Europe for almost all geographers. And later that the Ural mountains and the Ural River is the border of Europe as we have it today in most geography books in the world, is very new. That's of the 18th century by a Russian geographer, in fact, an Enlightenment thinker, a scientist, Vasily Tatistchev. And I have to say, I don't know Russian, so I get help with this quotation that the Ural Mountains are the natural border between Europe and Asia. The argument is that the water flies into different regions with the Ural Mountains. So I have help here, but it's important to have these quotations in European languages that people often overlook. So that's why I have the different languages here also on the slides. Okay, let's turn to this first cliché. As in this quotation, Europe is the continent that gave birth to a hope for reason. Every person who thinks and acts in the spirit of the Enlightenment, that's the 18th century Enlightenment, Rousseau, Kant, and so forth, is a European. That's a quotation I've taken from an Austrian writer, Robert Menasse, but it doesn't really matter very much where it is from. You would encounter it in books. But there's something disconcerting about this quotation, because if you take it very generally, people who are rational or use scientific reasoning, if you take it in this very general sense, then obviously if you are a Chinese scientist, you are a European. That's not very convincing, isn't it? But Robert Benasse clearly, and people who speak like this, and usually it's progressive people who speak like this, they don't realize they're using a form of Midwestern European arrogance. So one argument against this is that critical reasoning is a crucial driving force of history that we find basically on all continents. The moment we have written documents, we find, for instance, skeptics. For instance, in India, Buddhism, pages, hundreds of pages of skeptical arguments about whether we can know the external world, whether gods are existing. So even certain form of secularism. You have also in Hinduism. It may well be that the gods don't exist. You find also in some of the religious writings. So skeptical voices we have basically as soon as we have knowledge claims. It's not as if this was invented by Voltaire or Kant. Criticism of religious authorities or criticism of authorities in general, authorities that make knowledge claims. Also Chinese philosophers, some of the Confucian philosophers, if you look at them, or scientists, they speak of the right to freely speak in front of a king. Yeah. So these topics are there very early on. They're not an invention by European scholars. Of course, in the 18th century then, you get certain theories about, for instance, the parliament or participation in a democracy or individual rights that you don't have on many different parts of the world, but they're based on a basis, a fundament of critical reasoning that is very universal. Okay, and the second reason is that if we think about the Enlightenment, also about the separation of state and religion, which is sometimes when the French make immigrants say, okay, you still have to learn how to separate state and religion, which is very strange to do. It is very as if this was an idea that no one else had invented first. But the important thing to see here is that in Christian Europe, the clergy, the priests, had an enormous secular power until the 18th century. They were owning land, they were ruling their territories, especially in Midwestern Europe, also in Russia. The greatest landowners were the cloisters in Russia, for example. So you had enormous secular power, also juridical power, executive power with clerics. And that's, for instance, something we almost never have in Islamic history. Because there are many reasons to this. You could say Thomas Bauer also writes about this in his book. I think it's translated into Turkish. Thomas Bauer, also a very good book. And it's like a factual division between the clergy and the state, also in Ottoman times, in the sense that you don't interfere with me, and I leave you alone. So both sides do this. Of course, you could, as a clergyman, have certain ranks, but it's not a given. It's not. You don't rule a country. So they had a problem, basically, in Midwestern Europe. They had a problem with the secular power of clerics, and that's why, so to speak, they got the Enlightenment, because they badly needed the Enlightenment, one could say. Okay, and one result that we are still dealing with is that we have seen the geographical concept, but in Midwestern Europe, a cultural concept of Europe developed, but very late. So only around 1700 this developed. And you can see here, that's a very nice study by Malcolm Yapp, who's a historian in London. He has looked at the instructions for the French ambassadors here in Istanbul. And these instructions cover 100 years. And at the beginning, they always speak of Christendom, yeah, chrétienté. But at some point, they replace chrétienté, Christendom, by Europe. And it's clear that they, with Europe, don't mean the geographical name anymore. But it's only those parts that are Christian and Latin Christian, basically. So, and that remains, and that's now a cultural concept that has been moving away from the geographical concept. And the problem is that you now have to discuss who belongs to this kind of Europe. The question arises, who is included? If you make a cultural concept, you have to agree on, for instance, whether the Ottoman Empire is part of it or Russia is part of it, and they didn't agree. Yeah, Voltaire, Montesquieu, and so on. Also others, like in Germany too, and in England, there was no agreement whether Russia would be part of Europe or the Ottoman Empire. And if you look in Baroque encyclopedias, you can also see many say, okay, there are 3 Caesars, yeah, C, Kaiser, or Tsars in Europe. The Ottoman Sultan, the Tsar in Russia, and the German Kaiser. So these are but that doesn't fit with the cultural concept anymore. That is also on vogue. So we see here it's a problem, and we are still impressed by it. Yeah, this, Montesquieu said, Europe is where we have the spirit of freedom. And Europe ends where the spirit of servitude, of Knechtschaft, yeah, begins. And this is problematic, highly problematic, and we are still impressed by it. And but why are we still impressed by it? Because we do not hear voices of other Europeans, people who are on the continent at the same time. We have already heard Wassily Tatistchev, an Enlightenment thinker who spoke about the euro, yeah, the geographer. Here I have another quotation from Moses Kunitzer, a Budapest rabbi, and he speaks about the Sephardic prayer language. Sephardic is practiced only in a certain area. It's not the Ashkenaz prayer language of the Jews, but the Sephardic. And he says, who live in Europe, the Jews who live in Europe and in the cities of Turkey and Italy. Yeah, he refers to them and he describes the cities. So the cities in Europe of Turkey are, for instance, Thessaloniki, yeah, or Edirne, Istanbul, Constantinople. So for him, and also Tatistchev, they're speaking of parts of Europe that Montesquieu and Voltaire and some German English philosophers of the time don't count among Europe anymore. And here I have a final quote by a Spanish Muslim, Al-Hajjari. In this part of the world, and he has mentioned Europe before, lies the vast city known throughout the world as the greatest of all cities, according to the unanimous opinion of all learned religions and people, Constantinople. So it's clear, of course, I had to bring some kind of quote like this to this city, but it's obvious that he is speaking also about Europe, because at that time, the Asiatic, where we are now, the Asiatic shore of the Bosporus was not that important to the city. There were only very few settlements. So for him, it's the biggest city of the world, and that has a long tradition. Here I have a Byzantine quotation from the Emperor Constantinos Porphyrogenitos, 10th century. It is right to place Byzantium, now Constantinople, at the very beginning. You could also say top or rule. Arche means all 3 things of Europe, since it is an imperially ruled city that towers above the entire world as the heir to the name of Emperor Constantine the Great. I therefore place at the beginning, Arche of Europe, the empress of cities and of the entire world, the New Rome. So for them, Constantinople, Istanbul is the place from where you discover the world, from where you look at the world. And so if we adopt Hajari, or we could have other quotations, or Constantino's viewpoint, where I come from, Germany, would be the Near West. Yeah, we could call it the Near West. We don't call it the Near West because of colonization. Yeah, because it's only a matter of power that we use the term Near East for, yeah, the Levant. Yeah. Okay, so much. This is a map with still the German names on it. Looking at Europe, the geographical Europe from the east. You see Orenburg is where Tatistchev worked on the Ural River. And you see Constantinople and Budapest. There's no, that our maps are facing north is just a convention. So it's just to give you another perspective, yeah. That these, and Kunitz lived in Budapest, so these are centers of Europe if you look at the continent. Now, the second big cliché, which is still persisting, is very nicely summarized in these quotations, and those who are German among us know this quotation very well. Es gibt drei Hügel. There are three hills from which the Occident, Abendland, took its starting point. Golgotha in Jerusalem, the Acropolis in Athens, the capital in Rome. From all of them, the Occident, Abendland, is spiritually wrought, geistig gewirkt, and one must see all three of them as a unity. That was the president of West Germany in 1950, Theodor Heuss, and it's a very powerful quotation because of the three hills, but also because he doesn't simply say this is the foundation of Europe. He says it's the combination of these traditions that makes up Europe in a spiritual way. So why is this problematic? It's nice. Yeah, but it's still, you can see it quoted often in Germany, but it is problematic. And one cliché that is persisting here is, to begin with, Golgotha, Jerusalem, is not geographically in Europe. Yeah, it's obviously not in Europe. There's something strange here. But also Athens and Rome. So in what sense are Athens and Rome European? If you look at the cliches involved, there's one cliche that all scientific rationality began with the Greeks. And as I said before, I was raised in a Greek gymnasium, or Latin and Greek, and I love reading Greek scientists, and I have a big project on Ptolemy in Latin and Arabic. Ptolemeus, the Greek astronomer. But it's not true that scientific rationality begins with Greek culture, but because we have in Mesopotamia and in Egypt, as many of you know, very important basic forms of rationality, like algorithms, for example, a certain form of deductions, certain form of classifications, hundreds of years of systematic observation in Babylonia, for example. And these traveled with, that's the current theory in research and scholarship on this ancient area, traveled with migrant craftsmen. So these ideas don't simply travel because someone traveled to Egypt, like Plato. As if Plato went to Egypt and then saw, okay, they have the alphabet, or the Phoenicians, I want to have the alphabet too, so I'll go back and bring it with me. That's not how it works. But it's whole groups of people, it's migration. And there has been migration in this area and in Europe always. There's migration is, so none of us here in the room belongs to a family that has not migrated. Yeah. And even if it's some centuries ago, this is an area where migration was natural. And it was so important for culture. Without migration, we wouldn't have these scientific forms of rationality all over the place. And we wouldn't have like a common space of science in North Africa, West Asia, and Europe, where everybody would know the same kind of logic, syllogisms. Everybody would know the four humors in medicine, same kind of medicine, very similar religions, monotheistic religions. That's because knowledge was traveling so enormously and there was so much migration. Okay, migrant craftsmen often organized in families or groups between, especially 9th, 7th century before Christ. And if you look at the Roman Empire and the Greek colonial cities and the culture of Greek, they are not European. They are European, Asian, and African at the same time, as is very obvious here in Turkey too. And I have one map in what is European, where I have only the UNESCO World Cultural Heritage Sites, Greek and Roman, but all of them listed on this map that are not in Europe. Yeah, so you get 24 of them. So if you want to get to know Greek culture, ancient Greek culture, or ancient Roman culture, everything about aqueducts, about theater, Colosseum, great statues, and so on, you can travel for years without going to Europe. You don't need to enter European soil, you can stay in North Africa, West Asia. So they are really combining this area, and the Mediterranean with the ships was more like a highway for that time. Yeah, it's the fastest way to interact in the old cultures, not going by road, but going by ship. So it's not a dividing area, as has long been, think of Fernand Braudel and these people, it's long been discussed in research. Okay, now Christianity. Was Europe a Christian country? And this is a romantic cliché that you find in romantic writers like Chateaubriand in France, or around 1800, or here Novalis in Germany. I have a quotation here from Novalis. The Middle Ages were beautiful, brilliant times when Europe was a Christian land, when one Christendom inhabited this humanly shaped part of the world. A great communal interest united the remotest provinces of this vast spiritual empire. Now, historically, as historians, we have to say, simply not true. Yeah, it's a dream. It's basically a dream of romantic writers after German and English and so on Reformation, Protestant Reformation, where you have the wars between Protestant and Catholics afterwards, and after the French Revolution. So they were basically dreaming themselves back into a golden age when they believed there was something like a unified Christianity that covered the entire Europe. But that was not the way how Christians in Europe viewed Europe themselves in the Middle Ages. I have just one quotation for you to show you this. This is from Adam of Bremen. So Bremen is the place where I was born. So I have one quotation from Bremen here. That's 11th century, so he's writing in Latin. And he writes about a city called Wollin today, which is, you see the arrow here, Denmark, Sweden, so it's at the Baltic Sea. And the river Oder is, that's the mouth of the river Oder. And that city, Wollin, he says, it's actually the largest of all cities that Europe includes. Yeah, maxima omnium civitatum. Slavs live in it together with other nations, Greeks and barbarians. So he says, and then he says it's very rich, it's very cultivated, people have good manners, they're very polite, it's full with merchants and everybody, Vikings and Slavs, and Greeks means Orthodox, not like he himself. And barbarians means non-Christians. But unfortunately, it's not Christian. So that's the only thing not Latin Christian, that's the only thing he laments. So for him, it's clear that the largest city in Europe, he doesn't know about Constantinople, the largest city is Yumne, Wollin, that none of us really know about because it was destroyed around, I don't know the exact name, but between 1100 and 1200. Okay, so it was always clear that Europe had pagan populations in the Baltic area. It had Jews in lots of places, many cities, Muslims on the Iberian Peninsula, later in the Balkans and southeast Europe, and then later the Mongolian that were called the Tatars that adopted Islam. So it was never one Christian land. So when we hear Pope Benedict, who died quite a number of years ago, he says Europe consists in the essence of Europe is Christianity and Greek scientific reasoning. And that's a cliche. And it's not historical. You cannot, from a viewpoint of a historian and a geographer, it doesn't make sense. Constantinople and Cordoba were by far the largest medieval cities in Europe for many centuries. They belong at the center of European history. We have the Mezquita of Cordoba on top and a 15th century depiction of Constantinople on the lower part. And this is especially between 900 and 1200, Cordoba had about 300,000 inhabitants. Constantinople we can only judge, so the historians of cities say perhaps 500,000, perhaps 400,000, and cities like Rome, 30,000. Yeah, it was a small rural city, or Paris, 30,000 people. It was very small. So when people traveled from Latin Christian cities to Cordoba or Constantinople, they were entering world cities where you meet many people. You meet Jews and Christians and Muslims and people from many different places. Lots of people who migrate because they find work and they are basically protected by certain laws, yeah, both in Constantinople and Byzantine rule and in Islamic cities. Okay, here it's from the West, yeah. So just another perspective, and you see how the northern perspective also in geography somehow disforms our perspective of Europe also geographically. Now, if we do this, if we are also critical not only about the colonial history, but also about persistent cliches, how can we still speak about European? Shall we not perhaps discard the term altogether, just not speak of Europe anymore? Of course, we can always speak about the European Union and use Europe as a shortcut for European Union, but that's not my topic today. We can talk about this in the discussion if you like. Now, if I ask you to sketch a panorama of European culture in about 30 keywords, yeah, don't be afraid, I won't ask you now, but perhaps you answer this, yeah? Michelangelo, Mona Lisa, Rembrandt, Gothic, so Gothic style, Classicism, Louvre, the City Hall, equestrian monuments with the rulers on a horse, Homer, Dante, Shakespeare, Goethe, Tolstoy, Beethoven, Verdi, Chanson, Rome, Wittenberg, Geneva, Moscow as the third Rome, Istanbul, university, the idea of the university, coffee house, Steiner is still around, pizza, Magna Carta, tolerance, Anne Frank, Marie Curie, Simone de Beauvoir. Well, I didn't invent this. This is the chapter headings of a good book. Yeah, Europäische Erinnerungsorte means this is also a French version of it. So means places of remembering, yeah, memorial places in Europe. And these are the chapter headings. So they make up a panorama of European culture. And it's pretty progressive. Yeah, it means it includes 3 women, which is good. We haven't heard too much about women before. And not too much Rome and Greece, because it's obviously not really European, it's more than European, apart from Homer. And you have one Tolstoy, you have one Russian. But the rest is all Midwestern European. It's very strange. English, German, Italian, French. The rest is non-existent. No Scandinavian, not even a Spanish name. Yeah, it's very narrow. So, and that's a cultural concept of Europe. It's very powerful. You will find it in many books, and we don't realize. Yeah, even if we like the European continent and some parts of its culture or not, we somehow impregnated, influenced by this kind of talk. So I think cultural concepts of Europe tend to be arrogant, ignorant, and exclusionary. They exclude other people. They exclude, for instance, Orthodox Christian traditions, or they exclude Muslim traditions or Jewish traditions, for instance, or Scandinavian, all those that are not in this mainstream. Perhaps you wouldn't use these words. Yeah, they're a bit strong, perhaps for your taste, but I try to drag you in my direction and make you think, yeah, perhaps there's something not okay with this way of speaking. So how could we do it differently? And one answer would be to look at the geography again. Take the geographical concept, and in fact that's how I started too. Yeah, I realized in my own scientific writings, in my publications, I use a cultural concept of Europe. I have articles, or I don't know, about Averroes, Ibn Rushd, for example, and his influence in Europe. But this article is not about his influence in Cordoba with his neighbors, and not about, I don't know, other Muslim parts of Europe, but it's about Latin Christian parts, not even all Christian, only Latin Christian. So I was very imprecise. So I'm not doing this anymore. So I'm using cultural concepts they're too unstable to be used in scholarship. So I use the geographical concept only. And then I look at Europe and ask what happened on the soil of the continent. And for instance, you can draw a map of certain cultural practices or institutions, like the Ionian capitals around 300 Common Era. You find a Ionian capital, you find them in some of Sinan's mosque, yeah, they're wonderful Ionian capitals, but also in India. It's the furthest east we have. And on the Atlantic coast in Morocco and in England. Or you look at the sonata form, a different cultural practice, Haydn, Mozart, and so on, very specific form of music. Around 1790, it's mainly in Vienna, Budapest, Mannheim. Or you look like Kunitzer, 1820, at Sephardic prayer language, you get this kind of map. Thessaloniki, Fez, Italy, Palestine, and so on, and Turkey. But you could take these nets, yeah, it's like a net where these cultural practices exist, and put them together, and you have a real net of overlapping practices. Ideally now, this is not really, my children don't like this kind of thing. They say you should have taken practices that are from the same time, yeah? Okay, you should have taken practices all of 300 after Common Era, for example, and then you arrive at such a net, and that is what happened in Europe at the time. You can also add military history, if you like, or technical innovations, and so on. And you have capitals, for instance, also in other places, but the combination of certain forms of music, certain forms of building architecture, certain forms of techniques, that's what is European, you could say. And that's a way of looking at it bottom up. Now, you don't start with a preconceived idea of what Europe is, but you look what happened on the soil of Europe, and could also do this with North Africa or West Asia, and describe, or Turkey, and describe a culture like this. And you often see there are hardly any practices that only happen on the continent. There's so much interconnection, and that's basically true for many of these areas in West Asia, North Africa, and Southern Europe. Okay, so what is the advantage of this? This is Europe from north. If I ask you to, oh no, if you go to a library and want to have a book on sacral architecture, so religious architecture, around between 1100 and 1200 in Europe, what do you get? What you get? Do you get these starved churches, UNESCO World Heritage Sites in Norway, in Borgund and Ornes? They're very famous, beautiful churches. This is religious architecture in the 12th century, wooden churches. No, nobody would give you such a book, yeah, because we have a different focus. Or do you get anything about the Erfurt Synagogue? It's also a UNESCO World Heritage Site that's in Germany. Or about mosques in Granada, 12th century. Or about the White Cathedral, the Orthodox Cathedral in Vladimir. No, what you get is the invention of the Gothic style in Paris or in Saint-Denis. Now you get the famous Saint-Denis windows and the invention of Gothic style. That's 12th century architecture. And of course, Gothic style is very important, very successful and beautiful, perhaps, if you like it. But it's so much more. So if we start looking bottom up, we see more. Yeah, it's enriching basically what we know about the continent. Or if you ask about famous European architects in the 16th century, Michelangelo, who finished in Vatican City St. Peter's Basilica. You all agree? Yeah, Michelangelo is a famous architect. Or Juan de Herrera, who built the Escorial, northwest of the palace, northwest of Madrid. But what about him? Yeah, I'm carrying owls to Athens or Sinan to Istanbul. Yeah, Kuja, Mi'ma, Sinan, Aja is clearly on the same rank as Michelangelo in terms of European architecture. We have world cultural heritage sites like the Drina Bridge, which his office built, perhaps not he himself, or the Silemiye Mosque in Edirne or the Suleymaniye. And this style of building, that's, I mean, you probably know, but of course there's a lot of influence in West Asia, but there's enormous influence of this style in Southeast Europe. In Bulgaria, Crimea, Bosnia, you have this kind of hospitals, of mosques, of khans, of bridges, yeah, many different buildings. And for several centuries, this kind of architecture influenced the architecture of Southeast Europe. And it's a big area. So, yes, Michelangelo and Sinan, yeah, that would be European architecture. Okay, or you go, final example, to a liberal theology lecture in 19th century Europe. Modernist theology, the very important modernist, reformist, not secularizing, but in the wake of the renewal of the sciences in the 19th century, modernist trends, and you get reformist Catholicism, surely mentioned in such a lecture, also liberal Protestant theology. But do you hear anything about liberal Judaism? Abraham Geiger, for example, the reform of Talmud studies, the usage of music in the synagogue? Probably not. And there's a fourth current of modernist liberal theology, Jadidism, which was so influential in Eastern Europe, especially in the Russian area. And one influential author, probably the most influential author, was Ismail Gasprinsky or Gaspirali, is that correct? Yeah? That's how you pronounce it? And he was in Bakhchisarai on Crimea, a very influential publisher, but also writer, and he tried to and he was influencing basically into Russia, Kazan, and so on. He was later moving also from Crimea to Kazan, and trying to reform education. Also the education of women, very important. So for Muslim women in Eastern Germany and Eastern Europe. And he was advocating an education where you combine Islamic authors like Avicenna and Farabi, Ibn Sina and Farabi, with Newton and Galileo Galilei. That was his vision for education. And so that's a form, I mean, that's part of the Nakhda, yeah, it's part of what you find in Kurtzman, for example, modernist Islam, the handbook. Gaspirali is in there too. It's just one example of how, yeah, there's also a Muslim current, but nobody usually, if they talk about theology in the 19th century, thinks of Muslim theology in Europe. But it's part of that history. Okay, so my conclusion would be on criticizing Eurocentrism, I would conclude and advise not to use cultural concepts of Europe anymore, but use the traditional geographical concept of Europe. And to look at what happened on European soil over the many centuries of its history. And as I said, centers like Constantinople, Istanbul, or Cordoba, they are not on the fringes, the margins of Europe. They are as centers, centers of practices, and people migrate to these cities because they get work, and they go back to their cities and bring these practices back to their cities. So they are very influential, not only in Europe, of course, but also in Asia and Africa, but they clearly belong at the center of European historiography. But they are not usually, at least not in the school books I had. And then I would argue that, as I said, it's basically a net of practices. There's no essence. There's no essence of European culture. There are too many interconnections with North Africa and East Asia. It's easier to describe European culture of this time as North Africa, East Asia, West Asia, and Europe together. It's easier to describe culturally. And the underlying assumption is, when I argued in the beginning that we have skepticism, for example, and critical thinking so early in history, for instance, skeptics in Buddhism, or skeptical philosophers very early among the Greeks, but also in basically every form where we have written records, is that the questions about law, the rule of law, or justice, or equality, or freedom, they are simple questions. It's not as if you need to invent democracy. Yeah, and democracy, our children, yeah, if they need want to play football, want to have a captain for their team, yeah, they vote, for instance. Yeah, voting is not that difficult. It's especially not in villages, and there are books like, for instance, by David Stay Savage, The Rise and Decline of Democracy, 2021, where he argues that autocracy and democracy are natural to humans. Yeah, you have independently in so many different societies democratic procedures, councils, and that kind of thing. And also to talk about justice and to claim justice and equal treatment is something that has in very many different parts of the world been part of history. I don't want to say that everything that has been thought on European soil was thought somewhere else. That would be wrong and very much too simple. But it is historically way too simple to believe that these basic questions that are so important for us, for our society today, but how the rule the rule of law, whether we can appeal to judges that are not corrupt, whether our children of different groups in our society have equal rights and equal chances. These things have always been a matter of discussion. Perhaps not always on the same level, surely not on the same level. There are many different levels of whether it's more like second order philosophical thinkings, models, theories. Yes, for instance, the Greeks were very good in making these second order theories about different rules. I call it oligarchy or democracy and so on. That's a certain level of reasoning, but the basic question of how we want to order our society and about the rights of individuals is not invented, for instance, by some French or American thinkers in the 18th century. And even in countries where the rules were mainly autocratic for a long time, like in China or in Turkey, you always have people who think about these issues. So it would be completely arrogant to call the question of the rule of law a European question. It's a world question, it's a human question. Now, if we find this arrogance so irritating, are we not fully, we could say we don't want this anymore. Yeah, we want to say these people in fact have borrowed everything from us. Yeah, they've borrowed algebra from us. They've gotten medicine from Ibn Sina. They got certain forms of chemistry, of technical innovations, and so on. And that would be very simple. And it's not true. We have too many, it's a giving and giving back. There are too many ways forth and back in history. Now we have translation movements, and it's from many different languages and other languages. Their translations basically in this area have always been very important, and you get it in very many different directions. So I would rather describe it as a common area where you have many shared scientific practices. And to be fair, in different centuries, certain groups were more active than others. Yeah. For instance, algebra was not invented by Latin authors, but by Arabic writing authors. But on the other hand, they were using certain Indian sources, certain Greek sources. They didn't invent it by themselves. You never start in this area from nothing. Never. And so that's one reason not to fall into anti-Europeanism. And another reason is if there's no essence, it doesn't make sense. Yeah? If it's only a cultural network to which we all, even now, belong, and now it has become a global network, it doesn't make sense to essentialize Europe by attacking it. Another important factor about this is we should I think, be very critical about arrogance and ignorance. So many European school books, or like Macron, if he speaks about the essence of European culture, or Benedict, they have a very narrow view, and they don't know what happened in other areas of the world. And that's very disturbing, and that needs to be criticized. But it doesn't mean that we cannot feel at home in certain European practices. So we can even abhor or hate or whatever. Hate is never good, I think, but be really repelled by like a speech like this by Macron, which is so narrow and so elitist, but at the same time love Proust, yeah? Or love Mona Lisa, or like some form of classical music. It comes from Germany. But you don't need to be from Bonn to like Beethoven, yeah, if you like Beethoven. Or you don't need to be from Scandinavia to like Scandinavian heavy metal. You can be anywhere in the world and feel at home there. And that's a different question. In Germany we say Heimat, yeah? Where you have your Heimat, your homeland is something where you relate to other human beings, and you can be from South Korea and your home is, say, in Bach and brick churches and Thomas Mann. Or you are from London and one of your spiritual homes is in Colombia and in Gabriel Garcia Marquez also. And that's because these practices, as Edward Said said, they are human traditions. So they don't belong to anybody. To feel at home in some cultural tradition is, there's no prerogative, there's no privileged access. Even for me, if I feel at home here in certain parts of Istanbul, you could say, okay, this is Dag Nikolaus Hasse'nin, he's not an Istanbul person. Yeah, but that doesn't matter. Yeah, if I feel at home here, it's okay because it's human culture. It belongs to everybody here. And of course, this is the problem also of identity politics. Yeah, for instance, can a non-Muslim somehow cherish being in the Süleymaniye Mosque? I think yes. Yeah. And or can a non-black person feel at home in black culture? I think yes. And Edward Said, in fact, who is often quoted as the father of identity politics, he said, no, yeah, I don't want that. I find this is against humanism. It's a very good interview. If you have time, check it out. It's an interview of 2000 with Dutch television program with Michael Zeeman. If you Google interview and Dutch television program Edward Said, you will find it. He's really on fire, Edward Said. He's explaining why he thinks humanism really is about overcoming differences. But the moment you try to make provinces of human traditions, you create differences. Okay, I think that's an important argument against anti-Europeanism. It is possible to be in the sense that you are so irritated by what comes from Europe that you don't want to have anything of it. But that would be very strange. I mean, for today, also for organizing, first of all, to feel at home at certain, as I explained, but also if we want to organize our society today, in the world, but also at home, we need good ideas from anybody. Yeah. And they may come from Descartes, or a Chinese philosopher, or a Muslim philosopher. It doesn't matter if it's a good idea. Yeah. And in that sense, it would be very bad to das Kind mit dem Bade ausschütten, to throw out the baby together with the water, to fall into anti-Europeanism when criticizing Eurocentrism. Okay, thank you very much for your attention, for coming today. Here I have still the four maps from the four different viewpoints that somehow exemplify that it makes sense to view Europe, but in fact any area in the world that we do research on and that we do study from different perspectives. Okay, I'd love to discuss with you whatever you find not convincing, or whether you want to know more about a certain issue, you're very welcome.
Thank you, Professor. I just need to ask about, is there anybody that truth seeking about non-European centered heritage to say, no, it is from the Arabic, it is from the Latin of any 18th or 17th centuries? Is there anybody who seek the source of the things? And maybe I just ask, is there anybody like you on the 17th or 18th century?
Well, yes, possibly yes.
If you think of Central Europe, there's this whole tradition of Orientalists who get criticized by Edward Said in his famous book Orientalism. But you can see when you read Said, he loves what he criticizes. Yeah, which is a good attitude in a sense. So he's very critical of certain trends of European culture, but he's also very fond of it. And the Orientalist tradition belongs to it. So the famous people who've traveled, for instance, to the Near East, or to West Asia is a better term, to West Asia and North Africa, but also those who started with classical Arabic studies in the 16th, 17th century, like Golius in Leiden or Euphenius in the Netherlands. And there were people who were very open. There was a lot of traveling, in fact. I mean, of course, there was in the 16th, 17th century the New World in America, but the imagination of many Midwestern Europeans was much more focused on the Ottoman Empire. So I think but they're not very prominent voices. Yeah.
Is there any breaking point that they leave the gratitude to the West?
Yeah, well, I skipped one quotation, which, because it was taking too long. And this is in Baroque times here. In a Baroque lexicon, I think that's the period. Yeah, early 18th century, that's the Siedler, very much read Baroque lexicon. And what he says here, the Europeans, by their skill and bravery, have also brought the most excellent parts of the world under their rule. Durch ihre Geschicklichkeit und Tapferkeit, for those of you who know German, haben sie die vortrefflichsten Teile der Welt unter sich gebracht. That is, they conquered it. And he explains before why Europe is the most, has the best land, it's very fertile, the air is moderate, very good manners, and ingenious in science and crafts. Yeah, höflich, which is nice, yeah, and sinnreich, so erfindungsreich, many inventions. So, but then colonialism. Yeah, the experience of colonialism really shaped so much of it, because they experienced the military power, and that corrupted not only the countries they conquered, but also the conquerors themselves. It corrupted their attitude towards reality, basically. And I think that it's a long version of this that I was discussing today. Is Europe is the best continent? It's coming from colonial times. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for this very inspiring talk. I have a lot of questions, but I will just ask one. Since I was also raised as a European and a German, there was one aspect of this discourse that, interestingly enough, you didn't mention, which is, of course, this utopia of Europe as something that overcomes nationalisms after the Second World War, and I was wondering why you didn't address that. But then you showed, of course, and this is something that we can observe everywhere, that whenever someone tries to overcome nationalisms, other kinds of aggressive nationalisms or racist ideologies very easily emerge. So I was interested in how this relates to the cultural debates. And then, if I may ask something else as well, since you are also, since you're a philologist, I'm very curious to learn from you, because you said that rationalism has evolved in many parts of the world since the beginnings of writing. And do you think there's a relation between script and rationalism?
Well, to take the latter question
first. The problem is with the oral tradition, we don't know. But I think, imagine you are a mother and your son is 12 or whatever, and you send them hunting for the first time with his uncles and the father and the grandfathers. And you say to him, so don't believe everything what they say. So think yourself. Yeah, don't just do all the stupid things they may do, but watch out. Yeah, something like this. So I think this, but I cannot prove it. That's an intuition that I have. That the moment you have people also in circles, for instance, like priests in a certain circle, shaman culture, you would always have people who'd say, well, it may be or maybe not. Yeah, and that's, for instance, because in the Upanishads, or in India, we have such sentences. Perhaps the gods exist, perhaps not. And some voices that were recorded, basically. That makes me believe that the moment you have a strong authoritative claim about you know something in the world better than others, you will always have skeptics too. But it's very difficult to prove, of course, if you don't have written records. And yes, I didn't mention the idea of overcoming the military conflicts in Europe by having a unified Europe. I'm a big fan of this idea. Yeah, in that sense, I'm very. I still believe that the European Union is very important at the moment. Also, when we have developments, autocratic developments in the US and in many countries where it's difficult to say what you want to say, to find a judge that you can appeal to, that you can trust, that would be impartial. And in the great advantage, as I see it at the moment, of the European Union, but many disadvantages, but the moment a democracy or a society based on the rule of law develops in a problematic direction within the European Union, you have like a second safety net. Yes, like it was in Poland and in Hungary. It's like a break. Yeah, they are, and you don't have that, for instance, in the US or in Israel, when the extremist developments. There's no safety net. There's no EU in Germany we have 20% extremists party. It's good to have the EU still. Yeah, that may, if they may come to rule, as they are ruling in Hungary or whatever, you can still appeal to another court, to the European Court. And for this I'm really grateful. And has moved a bit away from overcoming the military divisions into a new form. But at the same time, I'm very skeptical about calling this Europe. Yeah, and that should be very apparent from my talk. And as to Turkey, I mean, I'm not going to tell you whether you are European or not. I mean, who am I? Yeah, but if I use the geographical concept, of course, Turkey or the Ottoman Empire and the And 20th century Turkey has contributed enormously as being partly a European country, partly a West Asian country, to European culture and to Asian culture. It's very obvious to me. And in a sense, it's a very easy question to answer, how European Turkey is, if you use the geographical concept. Yeah. Is that an answer to your question, Esther? Yeah, okay. Yeah?
First, I would like to thank ISAM for the invitation to give us the opportunity to benefit from your scholarship, Professor. I have related two questions. The first is related to the cultural definition. You say that you don't like it, or you don't agree to, or you don't find it conducive. But I think it is the essence of the whole discussion, is culture. And if you compare what Mr. Emmanuel Macron said to what General Bonaparte said when he invaded Egypt, saying that I came from the Sultan to save you. You had a great civilization, but unfortunately you lost everything and I came to civilize you. Very big difference. At least he speaks about one product of Ottoman culture, that is cafes, you see. Now, how we can discard the cultural factor, definition of Europe starts by Christianity. Europe became Catholic. Rome and countries or states around Rome became Catholic, then they identified their continent as Catholic. Then you have the Luther, the war, then it became Catholic Protestant. And it carried on Catholic Protestant for years until the Holocaust happened. So Europe had to pay for that and accept, identify as Euro-Christian. Sorry, Euro-Jewish, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish combination. Don't you think it is time now to consider Islam as well, as a part of the components, studying Avicenna and Farabi and all these great figures who transformed or transferred knowledge, philosophy, sciences to make up what Renaissance and Reformation Europe is about? Do you think that it is time to make this recognition?
Yeah, thank you very much for this broad picture of the development of European culture. Of course, we cannot, I think I agree that we cannot simply ignore the question of what European culture could be. But the great danger is if we try to define it in these ways, we mention Christianity and Greek and Roman traditions and Protestants and the Jewish traditions, but we always overlook things. Yeah, we always overlook certain traditions that are very powerful on European soil, like Muslim traditions in Spain or on the Balkans, or
and the school on Averroes, etc.
Yeah, Averroes, yeah, and the influence of Arabic authors in Arabic and Islamic authors in.
It's more than any Jewish contribution.
You can't really measure it. Yeah, you have Maimonides is so important as a physician too, and you have Isaac Israeli and Masha'Allah, and often with these Arabic names, you don't know whether they're Christian, Jewish, or Muslim. Yeah, even Ridwan is a Christian. Isa Ibn Ali, the famous ophthalmologist, is a Christian. Then Ibn Sina is a Persian Muslim, but drinking wine, but still a good Muslim. And so it's, I think at least in our history books, I would agree, the contribution of people living in Islamic civilization to European history is not really there. Yeah, is not
because
mentioned.
Doesn't want to be associated with Islam, I'm afraid to say.
Yeah, well, that's one of there's a lot of Islamophobia.
Yes.
In different European countries, but one way one way is to write books like this. Yeah, so it's a book about European culture where I describe European culture that can still like your Beethoven and Mona Lisa and so on, and acknowledge that Islam is part of it. You don't need to feel at home in Islam, and nobody needs to feel at home with Beethoven or Bach. It's very elitist, or Proust or Musil. Yeah, there's a certain. To be historically fair, it all belongs to what happened in Europe. So the idea of the book is to be gracious, basically. Yeah, you can still think, oh, I don't really feel it. I think it's somehow foreign Islamic traditions. That's okay, as long as you recognize that it's also European. All of us don't like certain things about our cultures in which we live. We don't like certain things, I don't know, in Eastern Turkey or Western Turkey, in Southern Turkey, Northern Turkey, but we graciously think, okay, they are our neighbors, they are a bit different, but they still belong to the same thing. And the same should be possible in Europe, that you acknowledge, okay, perhaps I feel at home also a little bit in Islam, but others don't do. So that's fine for them, as long as they acknowledge that we have important Islamic traditions in Germany or in Europe.
I show this acknowledgement. You say yes.
Oh, you show it. Well,
I think here we can learn a little bit from the old times. I mean, it's not enough to simply speak of respect, I think, as politicians do. But if we look at a city like Istanbul in the older times, before 1923, or if we look at Cordoba or Kiev or Prague in the Middle Ages, these were multi-ethnic cities. And you would have Jews and Christians and Muslims. You have, next to Kiev, you found dirhams, many Arabic dirhams, 30,000 or something, yeah, because Muslim trade was so active in the Middle Ages. Yeah. So, but you wouldn't marry across these borders. For instance, if you are Armenian, you probably wouldn't marry a Latin Christian or Jewish. And you don't pay probably the same tax, or you wouldn't have the same rights for birth and death and marriage. But apart from that, you would meet in the market, you would meet in certain social areas, and you would go on the feasts of the others. You would tell your boys and girls, you go to our neighbors and congratulate. Today is the feast of so-and-so, and they're celebrating it, so you get some nice sweets, yeah? And you go there and pay them respect. And we have many records of this. This is also probably better than I do. So the sociality in the Mediterranean area, in general, in this area also in Andalusia, but in Ottoman cities, you would celebrate also the feasts of the other religions in a certain sense. So Muslims would go to St. John's feast in Cordoba because there were horse races. and sometimes organized by the Calvinists. It's a very conservative, we know this because the very conservative theologians and jurists, the Islamic didn't like it. So they wrote, Muslims shouldn't give presents to Jews on their feast days or to Christians on their feast days. So we know that they did this. And we know also from studies on Palestine in Ottoman times that they would go to the same tombs, like Rachel, Rachel. And so there are some certain common practices, just to finish, certain practices, and that's something to learn, I think, for today. We don't have these kinds of active forms of respect. Even if you return to your own culture, we all have our own groups that we live in. But it's good to, from time to time, to go to the others and congratulate and then return again. That was like a routine of respect that really helped these old multi-ethnic societies, I think. Sorry.
Well, just a footnote to what you said. Still, this tradition is existing in Turkey. And you can see it in Bucharest between Muslim Turks and Greek churches. But my last question, I ask your opinion as a scholar who spent a long time studying these issues between different components of Europe. There is a saying that between Catholics, between Rome and the Jews, there was a historical reconciliation made, I think, in the 60s between the Holy See and Israel. And that was the beginning of a new era in the relation between Catholics and the Jews. Historical reconciliation. Now, there is a trend saying, let's have a similar reconciliation between Muslims and Christians. And the advocates of this idea says that it should be more easy because we were never accused of killing the issues.
Yes.
So what do you think, Professor, of this idea?
Well, I heard this idea from Schuster, who's the lead, the president of the General Council of Jews in Germany, who's a very modest and sensitive person, and he said, yes, it's time. He doesn't give up hope that there's possible some sort of, like between, as you said, between Christian Catholics and Jews in the 60s, to say we are part of the same story, in a sense. We share so many things. He doesn't give up hope that this would be possible between Islam and Christianity. I don't know whether this is necessary. I think for me it would be enough if I know, well, the first step is to know when the others have their feast days. Yeah, in Germany, it's slowly developing. It's taking a long time just to know when Ramadan is, for example. Just to be aware of the fact that, or when, but it's coming. Yeah, and to pay this basic form of respect, because of course it's nice to have the leaders of the big communities somehow agreeing on something theological. But I find the other thing more important, to get along with your neighbors, basically. If you say it's still active, this kind of, I think it's still also in Lebanon and in Syria, it's still striving for, yeah, here as well, yeah. And I was, yeah, you were showing me, Kadi was showing me here in this village, you still have Christian churches and Jewish synagogues. So it's still it's still there. And perhaps in other cities is more prominent still when you come more in that direction, in Antioch or in Beirut, and it's struggling to survive in present-day Syria, for example, or in Palestine. It's under pressure a lot. So I don't know. I'm not sure. We need something that is, because many of us are secular. So we need also the people who are secular be part of this, being. That they find it normal to say, oh, yeah, I know, I don't celebrate your feast, but I hope for you have a good day. Yeah, that's is more than any, if any important person says any important thing. I think, but I don't know. It's my vision of it. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks. I wanted to ask about the. Thanks. Hi, I'm Michael, a PhD student from Princeton University. I wanted to ask you about the idea of separating the humanities from the technical or hard sciences, which was a big idea of late 19th, early 20th century reformists and nationalists in many different countries, particularly in the Middle East. And they sort of thought of it as the Japan model, thinking that after the Meiji Restoration in Japan, they were able to capture the best part of technology and math and science and engineering from the West and sort of discard the humanities aspect of skepticism and Hellenistic philosophy and things like that. And it seems like, to me, that's been quite successful. And the export of engineering and the bureaucratic state and things like that is quite total around the world. And that actually many places you go and there's sort of no interest in Voltaire and Hegel and Mona Lisa and Michelangelo. And they actually feel that that's okay, we took all the things you had to offer. And I wanted to propose to ask what you think about seeing Macron's statement as almost a call for help to, reassert the importance of Europe in the 21st century.
Well, I don't want to say anything bad really about Macron because he's probably one of the most capable, more capable French premier ministers. Yeah, so we had worse people. Thank you for coming. Yeah, but I'm sure he does. He thinks he doesn't need help. Yeah, but he's famous for being very elitist. I think you're right. Scientific languages become global, and also in education. But since 1947, with the Declaration of Human Rights, or 48, I think of the UN, the language of human rights has also become global. And that's so long ago. We have just celebrated it. As you perhaps know, there was also Arab and Chinese people who formulated, helped with the formulation. And still, of course, in French schools, American schools, they somehow teach that they invented it, but that's a bit crazy. But for the rest, I think it has become kind of universal language. And I have the impression from my field philosophy that when Chinese students, for instance, apply, or students from Iran to come to Germany, the syllabus is not so different. They have pieces of what they call then continental philosophy or European philosophy, Chinese philosophy, something on Chinese logic, yeah, but also Greek logic, and then it has become global, and a bit like our departments now develop into something similar. So we getting more similar, and we giving geographical names to it. So we giving, either we teach For instance, I had a course on virtue ethics, a Greek author, an Indian author, a Chinese author. And that's becoming very, so Aristotle, Shantideva in India, and Zhangzi in Chinese. So I think that's becoming more and more common in history, in philosophy departments, that you have Descartes, Avicenna, Zhangzi, and Kripke, whatever, yeah, on the same topic, basically. Or you have a course on continental philosophy, on analytic philosophy, and Indian philosophy, something like this. So I think there's a development where perhaps it's what you described, what is of the time of the Nachda, basically. Yeah, it's now happening with humanities too. And it may be, I'm not so sure about literature departments too. Yeah, you have comparative literature since a long time, but I believe people applying now for literature courses, you will get something like South American literature, African American literature, Chinese literature. And I think it's a good development. So that has lost some ground. Yeah, I would, true what you described. Somehow science was easier to be made global. But it's overcoming also these cultural identity problems a little bit. Not for everybody. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Yeah? Yeah.
Hello. Thank you for your insightful talk. I'm a master's student in Islamic history, and I study Sicilian Muslims in 9th and 10th century. And I'm curious about the characteristics of societies that become interacted with Muslims in history. My question is, some Eastern communities, societies like Turks and Iranian societies, and also African societies like Berbers, they became Muslim over time after coming into the contact with Muslims. But in parts of Europe, like Spain and southern Italy, even though there was a strong interaction with Muslims in that years, we don't really see the same kind of conversation or adaptation of Islamic culture and ideas. So could this be related to some certain characteristics of Europe? Can we say that?
Yeah. I don't think so. Because I'm not so knowledgeable about Sicily, so you know more about Sicily than I do. But for Andalusia, or for the Iberian Peninsula, there are examples of many people on the Iberian Peninsula, many Christians, becoming Muslims. Because it was the easiest way, not probably because, I mean, we don't know the reasons, yeah, but it was the easiest way to also to do commerce and to be successful also in the administration, because the caliphs in Andalusia liked to pick people that were not Arab and not Berber, because the two didn't get along very well, and so they didn't want to, the caliphs, Abdurrahman I, the second and the third, they didn't want to base their power on the old Arab families, the Qurayshi and so on, because they are so powerful. So they picked Jews and Christians and also people who converted from Christianity. So and if you think of Iraq, there was not, for a long time Iraq was mainly Christian or Jewish. So you had a certain Muslim elite, so in the first centuries after Islam. And after a while it became very Islamic, but it took several centuries. So I think the image, I think the development we have is not so different. It, in some areas it was quick, but it remained a tactic to have several groups in one, also power tactic in one area, to be able to, to divide the power as the ruler, and to, if you don't get along with a certain group of Muslims, you still have the Christians or the Jews or another ethnic group or the Zoroastrians to base your power on. So I don't think that there's anything specific about the European soil here, because we have many examples, and Arabic was so successful as a language in Spain. So even after Christian conquests, we have research that 300 years later, people still speaking Arabic, even though they are Christian or Jews. But yeah, so it's that would be my question. The amalgamation, I think, is similar. Yeah. But what we could say about Sicily is that Sicily, as an island, in a sense, has had an enormous history of migration, much more than many other parts of Europe. And it's fascinating. Yeah, when you go to certain parts, you see, how's it called, next to like 1 hour from Palermo, in the hills, you have these ruins. You see old pagan things, and you see the mihrab of a mosque, and Christian places all over the same place. Yeah, used again and again by very many different ethnic groups and the Vikings and so on. So that's, I think, is very specific about Sicily. So many different groups. Yeah. But I think there's also research that they do the same kind of routines of respect among each other in the feast days. I have to check. But that they eat some bread of, I don't know, of Jewish neighbors when on their day and so on. Yeah. Well, thank you for the discussion. You have another question?
Thank you so much. I'm also a student at ISAM, and I really enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
And forgive me if I'm not understanding what you're saying correctly, but I still wanted to engage. So I'm just wondering, we talk about something called the Islamic tradition. I'm wondering if we can equally talk about something called the European tradition. And I'm wondering if your presentation is in some way conveying the European tradition in its value of exchange and contact and cultural diffusion in a way that perhaps other societies may not be so defined by. And I guess I'm thinking about the kind of now fashionable concept of alternative modernities and the alternative modernities. Yeah, the idea that perhaps other people have perhaps these things that you outlined, law, justice, equality, freedom, as not necessarily belonging to Europe, and also being an obvious virtues for places where there has been autocratic rule, is perhaps universalizing a bit the ethics and virtues of humans, and perhaps it is a humanist take that is deeply embedded in the European tradition. So
what would be a humanist take?
Humanistic take.
Oh, humanistic take.
Like, I'm wondering, yeah, I guess in a more concrete way, I'm thinking, for example, if we think about equality, not all societies necessarily value equality as a virtue and in their own self-understanding, and often view that as an attack in some way. You know, gender is an easy way to think about this. I just wanted to hear you riff on that.
Yeah. Oh, that's a powerful argument. I think there may be a grain of truth in it, that this universalizing may have something to do with my upraising, basically, in European culture. But I think I tend to believe it's my experience as a historian. I do when you teach or are taught, you are two different impulses. You may either say, don't assume too easily that these things are similar to what you are, because it's easy to see yourself in the past. Or you can overdo it, yeah, and say, they are so different, you can't understand them anyway. And when I started to work on the interaction between Islamic worlds and Christian and North Africa, West Asia and Europe, I thought I would write a book about misunderstandings in translation literature and cultural misunderstandings in the 90s. And I didn't find enough. Yeah? It was just not, the translators were really, almost all translators are embedded in a multi-ethnic society. They don't come from one part and pick something very foreign, but they know people who they can ask. Of course, you may mistake one bird for another bird or something, but it's not really interesting. It's not a cultural misunderstanding that is interesting. So my experience is that that's why I was quoting also Edward Said, that there are many similarities among humans, and that in general my interpretations become better if I'm not too strong on they're all very different side, but that I assume they would rather start with something pretty similar to us today. And I think that's where it comes from, and not from kind of reason is universal kind of thing. Yeah. But you're right, equality is not an idea that everybody makes a theory about. And for instance, in China, we have these very strong and interesting virtue ethics about your immediate surrounding, the family, your relatives, your friends, the people at work, in Confucian ethics. And that's not about equality, it's about respect. But in a sense, it doesn't exclude necessarily equality. There are some people who think that in these Confucian ideas, you have also ingrained certain ideas of equality. I can't repeat it now, but similarly in Buddhism, there are these ideas of you have to train equality. You have to train to understand the other person, to take the perspective of another person. So often in today's modern esoteric Buddhism, if it's adopted, it comes as if you just have to pay attention to yourself, yeah, like in populist versions of Buddhism. But in fact, in these classical versions, rather you have to understand how the other person is like, and to be able to take the viewpoint of the other. So it's very altruistic, and equality plays an important role. So you could argue that it's not the same as everybody has equal rights by nature. It's a different form of equality. But still there's somehow negotiating how to think about equality, because it has to do with altruism. And altruism versus egotism is, I think, something I would find because it's so basic for morals in many different societies. Yeah. But it's an important check to not to use like reason is universal as a. Yeah. Sometimes students also say your idea of the rule of law is also a European idea. But No, if you read Fernanda Piri, 4,000 Years of the Rule of Law, that's an Oxford historian of law, you can see that the rule of law is really anthropologically, of course you have Hammurabi and so on, but you have in Ireland early, completely independent of Roman law, rules of law that develop because people put a stone somewhere and write something on it they agree on, because they want to form their society. It's a simple idea, but that very many people have come about. If that's the rule of law, it's really very human and not European also. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, thank you for this very long discussion, and it's great because it's a more important part of such a day to get some of the answers from you and questions from you. Thank you very much.